So sorry, but this iPad that I'm filming with doesn't have a lot of memory, and by golly, it caught me off right at the best part. So this is actually 10.2, part 10.2. So you'll get kind of a half an hour in this half hour, but let me kind of back up just a little bit. So remember, he was teaching the dogs how to do the linking, and then that thought occurred to him. He said, if that sight brought the memory back for Edgar, might it do the same for Claude? When he was too tired to run the dogs, he sat and peered at the photograph of Claude and Forte. He closed his eyes and lay on his side, distantly aware that the dogs had gathered around, watching. For so long he'd lurched between one truth and another. Nothing had seemed certain. Nothing had even seemed knowable. But now, perhaps, he had found a way to know for sure. This is called the driving lesson. He heard the sound of footsteps on the Moe stairs, and his mother ducked around the vestibule door, her dark hair in a loose ponytail that swung sinuously across her shoulders. S.A., Tinder, and Opal were in the Moe with Edgar in sit-stays at the moment, and he was holding a length of thick rope knotted at both ends of the kind that they used for practicing retrieves. Almondine lay sprawled near the doorway. "How about a ride into town?" his mother said. "We could stop for lunch." The 3 yearlings, excited by his mother's appearance, began to lift their haunches off the floor, and Edgar stepped into their line of sight and caught their gazes until they settled back into sits. And when he was sure they would stick, he turned to his mother. "I wanted to keep working essay," he signed, a half-truth. He'd begun the morning practicing the tag and down sequence, but they'd fought him on it, playing dumb after being pushed night after night. He wanted more than anything to be left alone to work, for there to be no chance that the sight of Claude near his mother would bring on one of those cramps of anger that could snatch his breath away. The idea of the 3 of them squeezed into the truck, or worse, the Impala, set off a caw of panic in his mind. His mood, after a night of half-recalled dreams in which he repeatedly slipped from the branches of the apple tree into some formless abyss, was already black and raw. "Okay," she said cheerily. "Someday you'll be my son again. I just know it." He heard their voices in the yard, and then the truck started and crunched along the driveway, and Edgar and the dogs went back to work. He clapped up Almondine, and they went through a few retrieves while the yearlings watched. When S.A. had executed 3 fetches in a row without a mistake, Edgar rotated Opal through the routine, then Tinder, and then he began working with S.A. again. This time, lest she grow bored, tossing the rope into a maze of straw bales he had hastily constructed. When Tinder finished, he led them all downstairs. He decided to eat an early lunch rather than risk their coming back while he was in the house. He walked past the Impala, checking the impulse to mule kick a dent into its side, and let Almondine up on the porch steps ahead of him. When he walked into the kitchen, Claude was sitting at the table. He was smoking a cigarette, and the newspaper was quartered in his hand. Edgar's first impulse was to turn and stalk out while the spring on the porch door was still jangling, but he forced himself to cross the kitchen and yank open the refrigerator, pile of sandwich fixings on the table. Claude kept reading as Edgar slapped together slices of bread and cheese and pimento loaf. At last, Claude laid aside the newspaper. "I'm glad you came in," he said. "There's something I want to talk to you about." Edgar faced the cool depths of the refrigerator and pretended to hunt for something. Then he pulled out a chair across from Claude and sat and began to eat a sandwich. "You know how to drive that truck?" Claude asked. Edgar shook his head, which was the truth. His father had let him steer now and then from the passenger side, but only briefly. "Now that's a crime," Claude said. "When Gar and I were your age, we'd already been driving for quite a while. It's handy sometimes, you know." Edgar tore off a corner of his sandwich and handed it down to Almondine. "I've been trying to talk your mom into the idea we ought to teach you, but she's not convinced. She's in favor of driver's ed," he said. Driver's ed, as if it were the silliest thing in the world. "One day our dad just took us out and showed us how, that's all. After about an afternoon of tooling around, we were all set. Down to popcorn corners and back to begin with, a milk run, like they say." Edgar thought he understood where Claude was heading, and he nodded. "Of course, you and I have an advantage. It was all stick back then. Every truck we ever had, but the Impala's automatic. As long as your mom's off in town, I was thinking you and I might have a little fun. Something we could slip off and do. Something your mom doesn't necessarily even need to know about. By the time you get into driver's ed, you'll be the best in your class. Plus, you'll impress the hell out of your mom the first time you two go for a practice drive. What do you say? Edgar looked at Claude. Oh, he fingerspelled as he took a bite of his sandwich. Okay, he signed. Claude watched Edgar's hand, then slapped the table. There you go, he said. Swallow it down, son. It's time to take the wheel. Your whole life's about to change. He rattled the newspaper together and stood and twirled the car keys around his finger. Edgar set the remains of his sandwich on the table and stood and walked out with Almondine at his heels. The Impala was parked facing the road, driver's side, wheels resting in the grass. Claude opened the passenger door and prepared to get in, but when he saw Almondine, he tipped the seat forward and said, Jump in, honey. Your boy's about to amaze you. Then Claude said one thing more. He was looking down the drive with his forearm resting on the roof of the car. He patted the metal with the flat of his hand. Right here's something Gar would never have done, he said. He'd have kept you pinned down as long as he could. Almondine had jumped into the back seat. Now she was looking at Edgar, panting. He had been hearing a ringing in his ears ever since Claude had said the word son, and now something that had been hanging by a thread inside him seemed to come loose. He opened the driver's side door. Come out, he signed Almondine. You have to stay home. She looked at him and panted. Come, he signed, and he stepped back. Almondine maneuvered out of the car again, and he led her up the porch steps and into the kitchen. He squatted down in front of her and ran his hand over her head and down her ruff, and he took a long look at the sublime pattern of gold and brown in her irises. You're a good girl, he signed. You know that. Then he closed the door and walked back to the Impala. Claude stood watching him over the flat blue expanse of its roof. The 3 little vents set into the car's flanks reminded Edgar of shark's gills. Let's go. He didn't care if Claude understood his sign. His body language was clear enough. Claude dropped into the bucket seat on the passenger side, and he rolled down his window, and Edgar did the same. You know the gas from the brake, right? Everybody knows that. Claude handed Edgar his ring of keys. Edgar examined them up in the light and gave the gas pedal an experimental push. You don't want to pump the gas, Claude said. You'll flood it. The key slid smoothly into the ignition, and the Impala's starter whirred, and the engine roared to life. Edgar held the key twisted over a moment too long, and there was a horrendous grinding noise. He let up, then seeing the expression on Claude's face, twisted it again. He pulled his foot off the gas pedal and set it on the floor and listened to the motor idle. Claude started talking again, but Edgar wasn't paying attention. He tested the brake pedal experimentally, felt it give under his foot. The shifter was on the column. The orange tip of the gear indicator was under the speedometer. He'd seen people do this before with automatic transmissions. He pulled the shift lever back and dropped it into D, and the car began to roll forward. That's right, Claude said. Nice and easy. The steering wheel turned with a strange, oily smoothness compared to Alice. Edgar wondered if the Impala had power steering. Stranger yet was the huge flat hood extending out in front of them. He was used to a thin orange oblong with a smokestack coughing black fumes. This felt like steering from behind a vast blue table. The engine sounded distant and muffled, and he couldn't see what the front wheels were doing. He had to steer by feel alone. That's good, Claude said. Just ease it down the drive and we'll see what's coming. Take a left, head down toward the corners so your mom won't catch us if she's coming back from town. Edgar looked at him and nodded. He began to press the gas pedal, and then without quite realizing it, he'd made any decision, his foot kept pressing down, a surprisingly long way, until it was flat against the floor. The Impala bellowed. It fishtailed into place on the dirt and gravel of the driveway. Edgar had a good grip on the wheel, and he kept the car more or less straight ahead as it shot forward. Maybe a little on the grass to the right, but that was better than clipping the house. Whoa there, son, Claude exclaimed. You got a tiger by the tail. Let up. Whoa. It took no time at all to reach the end of the driveway. Edgar wondered how fast they were going, but he didn't have time to look at the speedometer. So much was happening. For one thing, the trees in the orchard were coming up fast on the right. For another, he had craned around to watch the barn receding in the back window, and that was difficult to do with his foot squashed down on the gas. When he faced front again, he thought a very long time before he decided not to run the car straight off the road into the woods across the driveway, because he knew they weren't really going that fast. Out on the road, they'd be able to pick up a lot more speed. As the last apple tree blurred past the side window, he started turning the wheel. Claude had stopped shouting, "Whoa," as if they were on a horse-drawn wagon, and reached over to throw the wheel to the left. They struggled a little, trying to agree on when to return the wheel to center. Edgar thought that should happen when the mailbox was dead square in front of the windshield, but Claude wanted to start earlier than that. Together, they worked out a compromise. The Impala's nose heaved left, and the car performed a deeply satisfying slide. And then they were crosswise in the road, or nearly, and there was the deafening sound of gravel being chewed up under their tires and spat at the quarter panels. Claude now had both his hands on the wheel. He had definite ideas about the direction they should be headed. "Okay," Edgar signed. "You steer." He took his hands away, keeping his foot smashed down on the gas pedal. Unburdened of the task of navigating, he could twist around to look through the rear window. It was exhilarating to see the road shrinking away like a broad brown strip of taffy being pulled out of the trunk. Also, now he had time to check the speedometer. He didn't know if it was right. It seemed like they could be climbing past 50 already. They weren't even to the fence line. Maybe it was just the wheels spinning out on the gravel. On the other hand, they had started moving pretty fast once Claude got them headed down the center of the road. Claude had once said the car was a Ford 20-something. Edgar thought that was good. He thought that meant it would go very, very fast. Air began to roar through the open windows. "Don't we get to listen to some music?" he signed. Then Claude was shouting about the gas pedal. Edgar reached past him and turned on the radio. Over the roar of the engine, he heard the steel twang of a guitar. "Country music," he sighed. "My favorite." He pressed one of the big black preset buttons to switch channels, then another. "I really don't like it when you call me son," he signed. "That's not right. I'm not your son." He turned the radio off again. "I can't understand you," Claude said. "Let up on the gas, for Christ's sake." "In fact," he signed, "I really don't like you being in my house at all." Claude reached over and tried to shift the transmission into neutral, but Edgar put his hands on the steering wheel again and wrenched it to the left. The car slew across the gravel, and a stand of maple trees filled the windshield. Claude let go of the shifter and put both hands back on the wheel, and to Edgar's surprise, was able to square their line of travel with the road again. Now the speedometer was up to 73. The Impala was jittering around as if it were traveling on a strip of ball bearings. That was the fastest he had ever traveled in a car, Edgar thought, and it was interesting that it was on gravel. The speed really ate up the road ahead. He could see where the dirt merged onto the broad curve of blacktop that continued north and veered east to Popcorn Corners. There was a little bridge over a creek up ahead, and he wondered if they could get the Impala up to 75 by the time they reached it. Before he had a chance to ponder it further, they'd arrived. There was a lurch, and when they landed again, Edgar felt as if his body were still sailing through the air while his eyes had fallen back to earth. He smiled at Claude and checked the speedometer. They'd made it to 75 after all. The hood of the Impala was tarnished, and that was a shame. On a nice day, he bet it would be fine to see the clouds climbing across that blue mirror stretched out in front of them, like flying into the sky. "Okay," Claude said. He had quickly gotten the knack of steering from the passenger side. They hardly wobbled at all, which was a good thing because the road was narrow. "Okay," Claude repeated. "You're the boss. What do you want?" Edgar wondered that himself. He really didn't have a plan. In fact, the whole driving thing had been Claude's idea, and there was that clanging in his head. It was driving him batty. He had tried hammering the heel of his palm against his forehead to make it stop. It didn't help, though. At least now his head had a reason to ring. He turned and grinned sheepishly at Claude. "Why not go all the way to Popcorn Corners?" he signed. "A milk run, like they say." "I don't understand you," Claude said. "You know I can't read Popco. "Don't effing finger spell at me," Claude shouted. "Let up on the gas." And then, before Edgar could react, Claude reached past him and flipped the transmission lever up into neutral. From where it sat, Claude couldn't have seen the shifter window in the dashboard, so it had to have been a wild guess, and he might easily have thrown it into reverse instead. That was an interesting possibility, and one Edgar hadn't considered before. What happened if you dropped into reverse going, 64 miles an hour? No, make that 58. Well, 50. The sound of the Impala's engine roaring while in gear now rose to a shriek, as if it might leap from its moorings. Claude twisted the key and the engine died. They drifted to a stop. For a while, there was just the sound of the two of them panting and a clicking, thumping sound. Edgar looked down and discovered his foot spastically pumping the gas pedal. Their plume of dust caught up with them. They then swept past a dry brown fog. The cooling engine block made a low ticking sound. "When do I learn to parallel park?" Edgar signed. "I hear that's tricky." Claude pulled the keys out of the ignition and sat back in the passenger seat. He couldn't possibly have understood what Edgar had signed, but he started to laugh anyway. Pretty soon he was howling and slapping his knee. Edgar got out of the car and began to walk back up the road toward the house, 2 or 3 miles distant. Behind him, he heard the passenger door slam and the crunch of footsteps on gravel. The starter on the Impala whined and stopped. Before Edgar had gotten far up the road, Claude had backed the car around, and then it was rolling alongside beside Edgar. The engine made a wounded sound, and something was tapping or clicking under the hood. What-ting, what-ting, what-ting. Tick-tick, 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 tick. "Guess I had it wrong about driving," Claude said. "No hard feelings." Edgar walked along. "While you're enjoying your stroll, you might want to consider that you and I have people in common. Your mother, for instance." "And my father," he signed. Claude couldn't help trying to read his sign, even when Edgar flashed it out. The Impala rolled alongside him while Claude replayed the gestures in his mind. "Yeah, likewise," Claude said, taking a wild guess. Then he gave the Impala the gas. It knocked and stuttered down the road. He'd gone about a half-mile toward the house before the car slid to a stop again, and he climbed out. "You're just like your father!" "Damn it all," he shouted, kicking the gravel. Then he turned and climbed into the Impala and roared away. Trudy. If Trudy hadn't been preoccupied as she drove to Mellon, she might have felt pleasure in the trip, for it was one of those perfectly warm June days when the sun felt like a voluptuous and reassuring hand pressing down on a person's skin. Ordinarily, she liked the radio, but the roar of air past the truck window was best for thinking, and Edgar was on her mind. He was engaged in a rebellion she didn't completely understand. It was over Claude, she knew that much. 3 nights in the last week he had refused to come in from the kennel, sleeping instead in the mow. But whenever she tried to talk to him, he would just walk off or stood there and shut her out, as only Edgar could. He had, of course, always been hard to read, even as a little boy. So inward and stoic, beyond anything she'd expected. He had virtually never cried as an infant. Almondine had done his demanding for him, half nursemaid, half courier. His teachers attributed his stoicism to his lost voice, but Trudy knew that wasn't it. In fact, Edgar had started communicating with a desperate urgency when he was only a year old. By the time he was 2, he had absorbed the clumsy, demonstrated basics of sign language and began, to her amazement, to construct a vocabulary of his own. There had been a period, memorable but exhausting, when he had demanded she name things from the moment he woke until his eyes fluttered closed in exhausted sleep. The ferocity with which he applied himself was almost frightening, and though she supposed it could have been a perverse form of motherly pride, she could not believe such obsession was typical. Almost in self-defense, they'd handed him the dictionary and started him naming the pups. He had also been demonstrative and intelligent from the very beginning, his questions startlingly insightful. She would watch him absorb a new idea and wonder what effect it would have on him, because with Edgar, everything came out, eventually, somehow. But the process, how he put together a story about the world's workings, that was mysterious beyond all ken. In a way, she thought, it was the only disappointing thing about having a child. She had imagined he would stay transparent to her, more part of her, for so much longer. But despite the proximity of the daily work, Edgar had ceased long before to be an open book. A friend, yes. A son she loved, yes. But when it came to knowing his thoughts, Edgar could be as opaque as a rock. A perfect example had been the Christmas when he was 5. He had started kindergarten that year, and every morning they stood together at the end of the driveway, and she had watched him board the school bus, and every noon he'd return, hands upraised to greet Almondine, who almost flattened the boy as soon as he stepped clear of the bus, making such a spectacle that other children called Almondine's name from the bus window. Edgar had been excited to be around other children that fall, but he wouldn't tell her much about school unless she probed him. What had they done that day? Was his teacher nice? Did she read stories? Then she would coax him into telling her the story. Sometimes there was a sign he didn't have yet, and together they would look it up in the sign dictionary, and if that failed, invent one on the spot. When December came, he had sat at the kitchen table and written out a wish list for Santa and sealed it in an envelope before she could read it. She had to wait until he was asleep to steam the envelope open. At the top of his list, he had written, "Pocket watch with a chain." It had taken her completely by surprise. He had never once expressed a desire for a watch, and he already knew how to tell time. He had learned when he was 4. For a few long weeks, he had included the time in everything he said. At 6:15, we're going to eat dinner. When I get done with my bath, it will be 8:30. That had quickly lost its thrill, but perhaps his obsession with telling time had just been internalized, gone opaque. In any case, it was the number one thing on his list, and she was determined he would find it under the tree. She and Gar located a watch shop in Ashland, whose proprietor rummaged around and back and produced an old pocket watch that a boy might use and almost certainly break, and it came with a long chain. The winding knob was intricately knurled, and engraved on the brass cover was a flowery letter C. Trudy liked the C. They could say it stood for Christmas. The man told them it would run for almost a whole day when fully wound. Perhaps it lost 5 or 10 minutes, but that would be okay for a boy. Better, in fact, since he would have to wind and set it frequently. They'd wrapped the watch and put it under the tree and made sure that the smallest green and box in green foil was the last one Edgar opened. He looked at the watch in his hand and smiled exactly the smile she'd been hoping for, and then he slipped it neatly into the pocket of his pajamas. "Aren't you even going to open it?" Trudy cried. "Press the little lever. Look at the hands." He took it out of his pocket and let them demonstrate how to wind the works and set the time. He watched intently, but when they'd finished, he closed it up and slipped it back into his pocket. That was the last they saw of it for almost a week, until Trudy walked into the living room and found Almondine in a sit and Edgar swinging the watch back and forth before her eyes. Almondine panted and looked past the swinging timepiece at Edgar. When Edgar understood that someone else was in the room, he turned around. "It doesn't work on dogs," he sighed. "You're trying to hypnotize her?" Trudy had said. "That's why you wanted a watch?" He nodded. "Come on," he signed to Almondine. "It'll work better on puppies." And he pulled on his coat and marched out to the kennel while Trudy stood there, mouth hanging open. That had been the moment she realized how he carried things around inside, things entirely separate from her. 5 years old, barely in kindergarten. She had no idea where he'd heard of hypnosis. She couldn't remember seeing anything on TV that might have put it in his head, and she didn't think of any of his books had mentioned it. Wherever he had picked it up, he had been walking around with that idea for weeks, for months, wondering. That was the kind of boy he was. And she realized that he was, in some sense, already lost to her, had outgrown her in some essential way. He wasn't keeping secrets. If she had known to ask him if he was interested in hypnosis, he would have told her. He just hadn't offered the information because she hadn't asked. And the obvious question was, what else was he thinking about? What else had he already learned that no one even suspected? Edgar's career as a hypnotist continued for several weeks. At the high point, he mesmerized little Alex Franklin into throwing a snowball into the playground teacher's ear. When Trudy investigated further, it turned out that Alex Franklin had made that claim. Edgar had only told the boy, deeply under the influence of his swinging timepiece, to take a bite of a snowball that looked more than a tad yellow. Instead, Alex had extended his arms like Frankenstein's monster and trundled toward the teacher, then wound up and let fly. Edgar hadn't expected that. The whole hypnosis business was unpredictable, he had confessed. Which led to a discussion about responsibility. It was like with the dogs, Trudy had told him. If you asked them to do something, you were responsible for what happened next, even if that wasn't what you intended. You were especially responsible to the dogs, she said, because they respected you enough to do what you'd asked, even if it seemed like nonsense to them. If you wanted them to trust you, you had better take responsibility every single time. And then she'd let him try to hypnotize her, but she didn't get sleepy. He'd been disappointed, but she wouldn't lie to him about it, nor would Gar. nor would Almondine, nor any of the puppies, who wanted to swat that watch out of his hands and chew it to bits. Then Edgar gave up on the whole idea, though he didn't stop carrying the watch around. Once in a while he opened the cover and checked it against the kitchen clock and wound it, but Trudy suspected he did this only when he was around them. By the time the snow had melted that spring, she found the watch lying buried among his touchingly small white fruit of the loom underwear in his bottom dresser drawer. If Edgar had been inward and opaque to her at 5, now he was a total mystery. Since Gar's death, he had been sleepwalking through his days, looking angry one minute, then tragic, then thoughtful and happy a moment later. Only working his litter seemed to capture his attention. She told herself she wouldn't worry. After all, he could have been shooting drugs, if a person could even find drugs in Mellon, which she doubted. If he really wanted to spend day and night in the kennel, let him. Truthfully, the latest obsession hadn't started until long after Gar died. Really, the last couple of weeks of school, when he had taken to running off from his classes. She talked with the principal. She wasn't going to have them cracking down on Edgar and ruining his attitude towards school for good when he was muddling through what she was sure would turn out to have been the worst period of his life. He was delicate right now. Deal with this rebellion wrong, and it would set. She didn't think that the lessons from dog training always transferred to people, but it was just the nature of things that if you punished anyone, dog or boy, when they got close to a thing, they'd get it in their head that that thing was bad. She'd seen people ruin dogs too many times by forcing them to repeat a trial that scared the dog or even hurt it. Not finding a variation on the same task, not coming at things from a different angle, not making the dog relish whatever it was that had to be done, was a failure of the imagination. And in this case, the analogy applied. She told the principal she didn't give a damn whether Edgar showed up even one more day than that semester after what they had been through, and if they pushed him any harder, she would withdraw him herself. They knew as well as Trudy that the teachers were coasting the last couple of weeks. Who cared if he sat in class and stared out the window, or if he just wasn't there? How many farm kids, she asked, were truant when it was time to show livestock at the county fair? She could use help around the kennel anyway. Then there was Claude, whom Edgar objected to. In his position, who wouldn't? After Gar's death, she and Edgar had grown so close it was almost as if they had been a couple themselves, making dinner, curling up together on the couch to watch television, arms wrapped around each other. She'd fallen asleep that way more than once, and on other nights, when he'd been the one to sleep, she'd stroked his brow like he was a baby. After that, of course, he would be jealous. Maybe she should have held back from him a little, let him handle his grief his own way. But when you're hurting and your son is hurting, you do what you need to do. Besides, Claude wasn't something she'd planned. About the last thing she'd had in mind, particularly after the nasty falling out between him and Gar. Not that she understood that, a brother thing, buried under too many layers of family history for her to unearth. Things with Claude had just, happened one morning. A breakdown on her part, a strange, momentary kindness on his. It hadn't felt wrong. Afterwards, she'd even felt as though some great burden had been lifted, as though she'd been given permission to carry on with a different life. What Edgar didn't understand was that it was all going to be a compromise from then on out. There wasn't something she could say, not to Edgar, not to anyone, but she knew it was true. They'd had the real thing, the golden world, the paradise, the kingdom on earth, and you didn't get that twice. Yes, Claude had proposed. That was silly foolishness, not worth discussing. Not then, anyway. Not when there was so much work to be done. She and Gar had the predictable discussion about what they'd want the other to do if one of them died. She'd been direct and forthright about his responsibilities. "I want you to spend the rest of your life in abject mourning," she cried. She said, "Cry in public twice a week. A shrine in the orchard would be nice, but I realize you're going to be busy handling the kennel and giving lectures on my divinity, so I won't insist on that." Gar had been more modest. He'd wanted her to remarry the moment she met someone who made her happy, no sooner and no later. That was Gar in a nutshell, of course, and when you asked him a serious question, you got a serious answer every single time. She'd loved him for that, among many other things. He was passionate in a way that Claude would never be passionate about principles and passionate about order, which he'd seen as a primary good, like those file cabinets. filled with records. The kennel had been important when he talked about what should happen if he were to die. He said he hadn't said it straight out, but he'd clearly expected Trudy would find a way to carry on the work with the dogs. So Trudy thought Gar wouldn't necessarily object to how things were working out. It looked like the kennel would be back in order by the end of the summer, and what they had both cared most about was that the other person find a way to be happy. Gar might not have liked some of the changes Claude was suggesting, but Gar had envisioned remaining a one-kennel boutique breeder forever. Claude was less concerned with bloodlines, which freed him up to think more broadly about other things. In the meantime, it was a matter of seeing into Edgar more clearly, making sure that he got through this bad patch. And that's all it was, a bad patch. There wasn't anything seriously wrong. She'd have known it at once if there was. We're going to end there.